So let's get started. Welcome everyone. We are here today at the Climate Change Reset Learning from the Global Pandemic series. My name is JOANNA ASHWORTH. I'm the Director of Programs and Partnerships in the Faculty of Environment at Simon Fraser University. And I'm going to be co-moderating this session with my colleague from SPEC, the Society for the So I'm blowing that already.
I'll get it. Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Oliver Lane. I'm the co-host. I'm from SPEC. I'm the executive director at SPEC, which is, I know it's difficult, Society Promoting Environmental Conservation.
Thank you, Oliver. Yeah, sorry about that. So SPEC and SFU are the co-hosts of this, along with Participedia.net and our other supporters, which I will talk to you about in a minute. Before we begin, though, I want to mention that we are recording this plenary session for educational purposes. Many people have commented, been in touch to say they can't attend today, but they would like to see the presentation. So we will be recording the presentation, all that is plenary. We won't be recording the small groups. If you choose not to be visible on the call, then you're welcome to turn off your camera. If you do not want to appear with your name, some of us have our full names, some of us have our first name or our organizational name below our picture on the video. You can also change that if you'd like to. We're going to use what we call the Chatham House rule today, which is where we do not attribute specific ideas or issues to specific people unless otherwise specified. And the reason for that is that we want to encourage an open exchange of ideas and not have people worry that things are going to be attributed to them. We want people to speak as freely as possible. But having said that, we also want to recognize the source of many ideas, and we will try to balance that. We are planning to write a series of op-eds from this inspired by this series. So we do want to be able to refer to the ideas in a way that is respecting all of you involved. And I just want to mention too that the session is brought to you by the Faculty of Environment at SFU. We're collaborating with SPEC and with Participedia, which is a global initiative on democratic participation. It's an online platform that brings together a number of researchers working in democratic participation. I want to recognize also the North Family Foundation for funding and Canada's National Observer as our media sponsor. So this series was originally planned as an in-person intensive for climate leaders that are working on climate mitigation projects. By February of this year, we know that more than 1,300 governments worldwide had declared a climate emergency. And then our world was plunged into a pandemic. And like all of yours, our plans were put on hold. And while the climate emergency is not on hold, there is no pause. It is a moment to take stock and an opportunity for reset, for transformation. And we're here still in the wake of this pandemic, but we want to explore this reset, what it could be, what it should be with regard to climate action. So today we're launching a 5-week web series. Every Wednesday at 9:30 for the next 5 weeks, we'll meet to explore these themes. The themes related to climate leadership, climate communication, the role of art and artists dealing with with climate action, grief and loss, cultivating compassion, climate justice and vulnerable communities, and opportunities for collective action. So there's a lot that we're going to cover over the next 5 weeks. But today's theme is mobilizing action on climate during a global pandemic, lessons for climate leaders. So it's really a framing conversation. And we're very, very excited and happy to have ANDREA REIMER and Sephora Berman here to get us started in this conversation. Their knowledgeable voices will launch us today. This series and this conversation today is about democratic participation. It's about community building. It's about knowledge sharing, and as much as possible using this medium, we hope to maximize your engagement and open up to questions, to dialogue, and to share in a spirit of generosity with each other, given the limitations that we have working online. Before I review the agenda and introduce the speakers, I want to begin by offering a land acknowledgement and then suggest a few community agreements. So we acknowledge that this meeting is being hosted on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, who are the traditional stewards of these lands. We pay respect for the enduring relationship between Indigenous people and these territories. And as Grand Chief Stuart Phillip has said, I absolutely believe that embracing Indigenous people and Indigenous values is going to serve us all in the long run in terms of developing a sustainable approach to resource development, which we desperately need. So if you are joining us from other parts of the world, which I think there are several of you, please take the time to learn and recognize the traditional territories where you live, work, and play. Well, I've also got a few suggested community agreements. If we can being as present as possible, that might look like having your camera on or your video switched on so you can be seen and see others. But given the circumstances, don't worry. If children, pets, significant others, or someone might walk through your room while you're on this call, we are all in a state of disruption to different degrees, and we just never know in every given moment what might be happening in the background. Please use the chat comments. We've started using them as you introduce yourself. Many of you are just joining the call now. And if you'd like to use the chat to introduce yourself, that's fantastic. And we're going to have a break where we encourage people to use the chat, and also at the end of the session. So we're hoping that we'll continue to that. But we also recognize that if you want to react or show your reaction to what you hear, there's a thumbs up or a high five in the reaction button. And you can also show your support by using, I think one of my colleagues, Sophia Yang from our team, was going to demonstrate using those features, but also the +1 reaction in the chat if you'd like to do that. So those are some ways to be expressing yourself while you're listening. And also take a few minutes to become familiar with the functions, the audio mute, the video, camera, your reactions, and your screen view. So, and just a little bit now, I'll give you the big picture of how this session's going to be structured using here's an agenda that we have. Jesse was going to put, thanks. So we've had doors open, check in, welcome, and Sephora Berman will be first up. I'll introduce Sephora, then followed by Andrea. So we'll hear from both of them back to back. Then we're going to break into small group inquiry sessions where you're going to have a chance to meet some others who are on the call, sort of randomly selected, and talk about what you've heard, and also talk about the big question that we have as a focus for today on climate reset on reset for climate action. We're going to hope to have some of those breakouts reported out, and we'll have a chance for reflections from all. Andrea and Sephora will make some final comments, and we'll check out close to 11 o'clock and adjourn at 11. And we'll also leave the doors open for people that want to hang out for a bit afterwards. Okay, so that's the agenda. Now let's get to the good stuff. So to launch our conversation today, we're really, really thrilled to welcome Sephora Berman to share her insights. Many of you know Sephora. She's been designing environmental campaigns and working on environmental policy in Canada and beyond for over 20 years. She is International Program Director at Stand.Earth, the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Committee, and also an adjunct professor at York University. And I would have to add, she is a national treasure and a voice for reason across this country and beyond. So thanks so much, Sephora. To turn it over to you, I'm not sure if you have slides that you want to share, but yeah, looking forward to hearing from you. About 12 minutes, and then pass it over to Andrea.
Great, thanks so much, Joanna. It's nice to be here with all of you today, and it was really nice to be asked to reflect on this question, because I think It's an important moment for a reflection. Everything is changed. I was talking to a colleague the other day who referred to it as a zero gravity moment, that when the world, when we land again and we're able to move about, that from the zero gravity moment, things will have and should have shifted. I appreciate you, Joanna, introducing me as a voice of reason. I was on another webinar this morning around building back better in Canada, where the proposals on the table on forestry are all about how many trees can we get in the ground, how much can we plant, and meanwhile we're clear cutting our natural and old growth forests still at an incredible rate in Canada, which are our carbon sinks, and critical for biodiversity and resilience. And so I was arguing that we had to shift the entire forest management and do considerably larger protected areas, especially in the endangered species habitat. And I don't think some of the people on the call thought I was the voice of reason, but nice to be here with all of you and having a conversation that recognizes the importance of moving forward on climate. So I prepared some thoughts basically in 3 areas. One is what I think are lessons learned that we can take from our shared experience on climate. And then looking at really how do we apply these lessons right now? And then specifically, what are some encouraging signs and help us figure out not just how to apply the lessons, but where to apply the lessons. So I'm going to try and go through that in about 10 minutes. So the first, I think, most important thing that really keeps shifting forefront in my mind is that our shared lived experience in this pandemic has changed the art of the possible in terms of our collective imagination. Because what's happened over the last 2 months has been hard to imagine in a number of ways. I think a big shock like this drastically changes the way that people see the world. It reshapes the public imagination of what can happen to us collectively, but then also what we can do together collectively about it. And I think most importantly, we are now acutely aware on a very visceral level that nature can kill us, that we are part of and dependent on the physical world, and that we need to listen to the physical scientists who are our way of understanding the physical world, of seeing what threats are coming. So most critically is this shared agreement that we need to listen to the science. But secondly, this shared global agreement that speed matters. And we saw that. We saw it with evidence in places who listened to the science quickly, like in British Columbia. I'm very proud of what we've done in British Columbia to flatten the curve. So speed matters. We have to take scientific advice early. We have to act dramatically. We have to take actions, even ones that seem in the moment like overreactions. We have to act before the bodies start piling up, because that's when it's too late. And I think most importantly, we've learned that we can do this, that people are willing to do it. Individuals, institutions, governments can take unprecedented actions, which put human life and health ahead of economic indicators like stock prices and corporate profits. So listen to the science and act early. I have a couple of slides that I'll show here and there, but I just couldn't help myself. I have to, oh look, the host has disabled my screen sharing. So if you want me to show any of my slides, you're gonna have to enable my screen sharing. Let me know when you do, and I'll show that one on science. But you know, over the weekend I was thinking, wouldn't it be amazing if we had daily or even weekly, I'd take monthly press conferences where we had a chief scientist, like the chief health officer, that was telling us how we're doing in flattening the curve on carbon emissions, that was telling us what we need to do next collectively, and providing, scientific evidence in the way that we've come to all in watch and certainly love our chief health officer doing that. And so I said that on social media. Wouldn't it be great if, just imagine this. And it went, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of likes and passed around and retweets. And I thought that was interesting because, again, it's our shared lived experience of how we listen and learn from the science. That's really important. Oh, look, now I can share this hilarious slide with you. So I'm going to. Do you see that one protester? I saw this not that long ago, and it's just stuck with me. I think about it all the time. And as someone who's been studying climate science now for almost 20 years, going to, every United Nations conference and meeting with the scientists and trying to figure out how to adapt that into climate policy, etc. It's been so incredibly frustrating. And it does feel like, if you're deep into the climate policy and the climate science, that it is like a kind of disaster movie. But I do think that has shifted, not only because of our lived experience in COVID, but also even before that, in part because of such an unlikely, in some way, hero, Greta Thunberg, whose call somehow broke through to listen to the science before COVID, which was absolutely incredible. Okay, so how do we apply those lessons, listen to the science and act early? I think we need to connect the new collective imagination to climate. So climate has a longer timeline, the cause is more complex, but it's the same basic plot line as the pandemic. We need to flatten the curve. So I think we can do this by going on attack after bad policies and bad projects because they ignore the science. And we've done this before on critically bad, massive, multi-billion-dollar projects, for example, like Trans Mountain Pipeline. And scientists spoke out and said what a terrible idea it was for so many reasons, and it was ignored. But if I've learned anything after almost 30 years of running environmental campaigns, it's that it's all about repeat, repeat, repeat. And sometimes it's about finding that magic moment when things get sticky. So this is a magic moment where listening to the science is sticky. And so we have to apply that in communications theory. It's called the resonant chord. So what's going to resonate out there with people right now, listening to the science, flattening to the curve, those things are resonant. So, we also need to really reflect and show that not listening to the science, building fossil fuel projects, using fossil fuel technologies, not moving forward quickly with zero emission vehicles, zero emission building, etc. Policies is to ignore science and make the same mistake as COVID, sleepwalking into a catastrophe, not acting early. We need to make the connections on the solution side. The actions to address climate are much easier and much less disruptive than with coronavirus. Not implementing the solutions is ignoring science. So I think we've seen some really encouraging signs over the last month. Civil society is flexing and government is responding. So what we've seen at Stand.Earth, and I've talked to many other nonprofits, specifically who work on climate in the country, and engagement numbers are way up. They're sky high over the last 2 months. More people are sending petitions, more people are willing to call their ministers, and we saw a direct result of that. So early in the pandemic, Premier Kenney came out calling for $20 to $30 billion of stimulus directly to oil companies. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers followed that by then putting forward a memo that was leaked and exposed by Environmental Defence Canada that called for massive environmental rollbacks to the oil and gas industry. Many groups across the country organized, including Stand.Earth, and we encouraged citizens to send petitions saying, don't bail out these big oil companies. Let's make sure that workers and their families are whole. Let's make sure money goes to workers and their families, but not in continuing to prop up fossil fuel industries that are trying to expand at this moment in history. The government responded. Literally tens of thousands of people engaged. The government responded. And the bailout package, you know, while there's obviously debate about whether or not taxpayers should be funding the cleanup of the toxic oil and gas legacy, which we shouldn't, the fact is that the bailout stimulus money was directly tied to cleanup of orphan wells. And that's, you know, that's an important first step. First of all, it's changed the nature of the debate in Canada because millions of Canadians woke up to the fact that we have an orphan well legacy and a toxic oil and gas legacy. But I think it really also showed citizens that we can flex muscle, that the federal government will respond. So it would be easy to imagine that the environment would get pushed to the back burner right now. But actually, you know, thinking about coming here today, I did a little review of what we're seeing internationally. And this, I think the signs are really good. Financial institutions from around the world during this crisis have continued to divest from fossil fuels. Governments around the world are pledging stimulus that will be green. Europe, Asia, in Canada, even the Global Trade Association of the fossil fuel industry, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, is calling on governments to implement a green stimulus. So this is very different from 2008 and the economic downturn. Green funds are doing better now than traditional ones. So that's really, really important about this moment in history. Studies surveying economists results in calls for clean energy, sustainable stimulus, where people are starting to realize and connect that climate action is economic action, that in the moment that we're living in, the oil and gas industry is performing and fossil fuel companies and coal at the bottom of the S&P index. They're going bankrupt at way higher rates, and meanwhile the prices of solutions and renewables are dropping. This is an incredible moment to take advantage of those economic arguments. And, you know, even in this moment right now, governments are swearing off fossil fuel expansion. If you didn't see it, take a look at what Spain did yesterday. It's incredible. It's a new law that is being proposed in Spain for the first time, a nation state government saying that not only will they divest from all fossil fuels, but they will not allow in law any more expansion of oil, gas, or coal. And they demand from all energy providers that within the next 5 years, they must show how they will transfer their infrastructure and equipment to geothermal and renewable energy. It's absolutely groundbreaking, and that was yesterday. Okay, so finally, where to apply the lessons? We need to apply the lessons at all levels of government and institutions that will be rebuilding. Internationally, I'll just show this again before I end. Internationally, Joanna mentioned my other hat. I chair the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. This is a group of economists, international lawyers, advocates, policymakers from around the world who have come together with a big new proposal. This is a moment for big new proposals. We're not saying we're going to replace the Paris Accord. We're saying that it can complement the Paris Accord. For those of you who don't know, in the Paris Agreement, the words oil, gas, coal, or fossil fuels don't exist. The Paris Agreement does not constrain in any way the supply and production of fossil fuels or ensure that we are reducing production and supply. The result is that last year, the Production Gap Report produced by the United Nations Environment Program and Stockholm Environmental Institute, as well as others, showed that we're currently on track to produce about 120% more fossil fuels than the world can safely burn in a 1.5 degree scenario. So while we were focusing on demand side reductions and emissions reductions, the fossil fuel companies were planning to build more fossil fuels and lock in that infrastructure. So this is a big, new, bold international proposal to immediately end the new exploration for and development of fossil fuels and phase out fossil fuel production. I urge you to take a look at it, fossilfueltreaty.org. And we can, and we hope many organizations around the world will start running campaigns to get their national governments to agree to a fossil fuel treaty, the first step of which is a global registry on fossil fuel productions, which we don't have, which would show, which would mean transparency on fossil fuels globally. At a national level, we have to be looking at what the federal government is going to be spending money for. In the coming year, our federal government, as well as governments around the world, will spend more money than ever in history to stimulate the economy. Billions, trillions globally. And so what are they spending that money on? This is a critical moment for those proposals. So at Stand.Earth, as well as many other groups, we're focusing on petitions for a sustainable recovery. We're developing what we're calling kind of green strings principles that would ensure that how we spend money is assessed according to carbon priorities, carbon reduction, as well as just recovery, systems that are more resilient and diversified, and also looking at the importance of protecting nature and forests. But on the national level, I think we also need to talk about food. We've learned how vulnerable our food system is through this moment. We need more direct support for farmers into regenerative agriculture, soil carbon sequestration. We need national home energy programs. We need an army of workers spread across the country to work on energy efficiency, converting natural gas to heat pumps in homes, Indigenous communities, public buildings, other institutions, local trades in every community across the country, as well as the manufacturing of doors and windows and other efficiency products. And obviously we need electrification. Let's roll out electric buses like those made in Canada by Lion and other manufacturers, and get the provincial interconnections between BC and Alberta, Manitoba and Saskatchewan on electrification. So, and then on a provincial level, I would say that one of the things that is absolutely critical is that we push to stop building out and bolstering and funding through taxpayers' subsidies the oil and gas industries. Scientists are pleading with us to do this. Our own government here in British Columbia has increased subsidies to the fossil fuel industry in the last couple of years and is propping up major new fossil fuel projects like LNG Canada and a massive increase in fracking. So we need to build economies of the future like hydrogen. We need to leap forward from the oil and gas era. And we need to, of course, build up public transit systems, electrify and expand, and protect carbon-rich and biodiversity-rich forests. On that note, I will say that Stand.Earth released a report specifically on wood pellets because it's a massive growing industry in Canada and it's not a climate solution. So I'd encourage you to take a look at it. And finally, of course, Andrea will speak far more to this than me and knows far more than me, but I wanted to end on one note about municipal action. We've launched an initiative that will be global, starting here in North America, called Safe Cities. You can see it at stand.earth/safe. And what we're doing is we're encouraging cities to stand up against fossil fuel expansion for health reasons and climate reasons and many more reasons. And we've developed a kind of pledge program looking at what the different options and policy buckets that cities can do. If you go to our website, you can see who's doing what now on the different pledges and areas. You can zoom in and get stories about what each municipality that we've identified so far is doing. And you can also sign up to the Safe Cities movement to run your own campaigns in your own region. Or if you're a city councillor, you can sign up to become a part of the network of cities who are working on safe policies to share practices. So I will stop there, and I hope I didn't go too far over my time, Joanna.
That's great. Yeah, thank you so much, Spora. I think you've really set us a very broad and comprehensive framework for thinking about climate action right now in the wake of the pandemic. And I think the lessons learned and the way to apply them and where to apply them, I think, are really instructive. So we'll look forward to hearing the response of people on the call, the questions and the observations that people have. But now I'd like to turn to Andrea REIMER. I'm very excited to have Andrea here. Many of you know Andrea is a longtime community organizer on issues of social, environmental, and economic justice. In her 4 terms elected to local government, she took the lead on many transformative initiatives, including the bold and award-winning effort to make Vancouver the world's greenest city, and committing Vancouver to be the first major city in the Americas to transition to 100% renewable energy. She's currently teaching at UBC and SFU and serves on the UBC Board of Governors and the World Future Council, and she's a recent fellow of the Loeb Fellow from Harvard. So I just thought I'd throw that logo up there because that is fantastic as well. So Andrea, thank you so much for being here. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this question of, what are the lessons in the wake of the pandemic for climate leaders? So
thanks, Joanna. Yeah, I'm unmuted. So thank you for the intro. As you heard, my name's Andrea REIMER, and I'm coming to you from the unceded traditional homelands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples, which you may also know as East Vancouver. At least the part that I'm in is East Vancouver. So I prepared some thoughts for you today. When I originally took on this mission of lessons from the pandemic, I thought this would be a fairly easy task because it feels like there's lots of lessons. But I'm going to leave it to you to decide if these are in fact lessons. I'd say I'd probably characterize it more as a framework to hold lessons within, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts about it. So the first place I wanted to start was with acknowledging loss. And there's a few reasons for that, but I think the most important one is that the people and the things that have been lost deserve to be grieved. You're not going to hear me talk about turning crisis into opportunity. And in fact, I think it's not just a dangerous place for us, but highlights a lot of the reason we were failing before the pandemic at getting more meaningful action on climate change. As advocates for climate action, we really need to meet people where they're at. And from the perspective of where they're at, what's been lost and what's been learned are very distinct things. Important to remember that the things that were lost were the products of thousands of hours, months, years, decades of work, of care and attention, of collective thought, of trial and error and perfecting and going over and over and over again. And all that effort, whether it was a small business, a large business, a policy win, or I think critically a sense of security in one's home, is now gone. So the hardest thing I think we've lost is the future that might otherwise have been. So all of us have lost the trajectory that we're on. I think, Sephora, you referred to it as a feeling of zero gravity, but that's part of why we're in zero gravity, is the arc of our lives has been inexplicably changed and we don't really know what it looks like now. But we do know what was lost in terms of building the platform on which the arc we were on is on. So that's a lot to let go of, but we need to do that. We need to acknowledge it's been lost and let go of the things we thought were both possible or the things we thought were impossible if we want to move on. So moving on, I'm not sure, again, if these are lessons so much as buckets that hold one of two things. The first I want to briefly speak to is things that have become impossible to ignore. So that's one bucket. And then the second bucket is opportunities for transformative change that only exist in the window of a disaster. So the first one, the things that have become impossible to ignore, I'm not going to speak to it at length because I think there's a lot of great commentary out there on it, but in the category, I would briefly highlight income inequality and the brutal ways that loss is inequitably distributed because of deep systemic injustice resulting from longtime policies of white supremacy and male supremacy. The commentary I would say about these, just to have you sort of confront that and consider it, there are actually two public health crises happening in Canada right now. One has claimed over 15,000 lives and one has claimed 5,000, give or take. One gets few mentions, the other gets a personal condolence from the public health officer and the health minister in BC every single day that a life is lost and has literally stopped the world. So if we truly care about justice, and we can do the things Sephora was talking about, act quickly during a disaster and make sure that lives are saved, why did we do virtually nothing to save those 15,000 lives and we have stopped the world to save the 5,000 lives? Perhaps we're just in an elaborate version of the prisoner's dilemma, and I think we really need to confront that. The punchline here being that don't presume injustice being obvious makes action to correct it inevitable. And the second I would say is to avoid the word recovery wherever possible, because it implies that getting back to where we were was that would be okay, that we're like a patient that needs to recover. From my perspective, not okay. So where I'm going to focus most of my talk is about the opportunities for transformative change that only exist in this window. And so 2 reasons, just to frame it up, about why these opportunities exist in a disaster. The first is a temporary power shift. Rebecca Solnit wrote a very prescient book for this time called Paradise Built in Hell. And if you haven't read it, I would strongly encourage reading it. A quote from that: disaster tests elites, and I would argue Sephora and Joanna and I all fall in that category as people who have good, solid jobs and university educations and all the things that many of the people who are made much more vulnerable in a disaster don't have. Disaster tests elites most harshly at what they do least well, and as a result, suddenly their whole legitimacy is in question. So there's nothing more elite in this situation than a government. So to put it another way, the usual base of institutional power, so that's position and authority, have a lot less power, and the informal forms, Sephora spoke to this, experts, referent networks, living truth, have a lot more power. So people in the elite category tend to race to try and keep up with where the people are at, to put it simply. The second phenomena that's happening right now is zero gravity, what I would call liminal space. So the feeling that March lasted a year and April a week, that is a perfect characterization of liminal space. It comes from the Latin word limen, which means threshold, and any point, a place of entering or beginning. It's a place of transition. So in concrete terms, if you've ever gone to a big event, maybe your own wedding, maybe a funeral, maybe your graduation, in your house, you're nervous and anticipatory, but the minute you leave your house, your stomach kind of falls out, whether you're on a bike or car or walking, and it's because you're not where you were and you haven't yet gotten where you're going. And the key thing about liminal space to remember is that the rules that existed in where you're coming from don't apply anymore. And there are yet no rules about where you're going because they haven't been written yet. So you have the opportunity to decide that. So these circumstances in BC have led to this spectacular public health response. And I'm going to highlight 3 pivots that I think characterize that response. As Sephora pointed out, it is by far the high watermark in North America. There are some issues around density that we could talk about. We also happen to be the lowest density jurisdiction that is reported out in the tables that you see about where BC is, and pandemics and density do have some relationship to each other. But in any event, it definitely, I would characterize it as a, notwithstanding the density issues, a very spectacular public health response. And 3 things I would point to. The first is that we're all in this together. So this idea that our actions affect others, that their actions affect us, and very critically, government is the lead actor in helping us navigate that. It is a radical change from where we were mid-February. When you remember, we were in the middle of what Sowetan and sort of national protests and shutdowns. That is not how we were thinking about the world. The second thing I would say is mutual aid, this idea of neighbors helping neighbors. And you've seen this door by door, block by block in your communities. I'd invite you to think about what that looks like when we talk about neighboring regions and neighboring geographies. And the third thing, which I think is by far the biggest shift in opportunity, is agile management. So the traditional approach of government, you have a long period, it's called waterfall management. You sort of climb up a high cliff to get to the top of it. That comes in the form of consultation and stakeholder panels and experts and large public debates. And you get to the top with your new policy, and then you have one moonshot to go down that waterfall, evaluate, and then decide whether to cling to this new policy or abandon. It's a very high stakes approach to it. So now that we're into this agile management period, we're like try, learn, build, test, repeat. That's what happens every day. That's what you're watching in real time. It's a massive change in approach, and even more massive change to the range of opportunities it enables. I actually realized fairly early on in the pandemic that all the things I thought had been the enemy of climate action over the last number of decades, 3 decades now, the one that I had never identified and I think is actually the biggest enemy is perfect. This idea that we had to come out of the gate at the top of the waterfall with a perfect plan, that was never going to happen. And the public health response has shown that you can be hugely successful by not being perfect the first time out. In fact, it's critical to try and learn, build, and test and repeat and go through that process over and over. So what does it all mean for the future? The upshot is that there are things that are always true. For example, I would say this phrase is 100% of the time true. The best way to own the future is to be the one building the future. It's what we did in Vancouver with the greenest city. We didn't wait to have someone tell us how we were going to make it work in their reality. We decided to choose a reality we wanted to build towards, and we did it. But the thing that is new about this moment is that the opportunity exists for us to define X right now. Normally, we're just solving X. We're responding to someone else's context, and we're trying to like figure out how our X, climate action in this case, gets through that. In this case, we actually get to choose the reality. Put another way, in a crisis, what was once unthinkable can suddenly become inevitable. So the lessons, and I'll air quote that, to be drawn aren't so much from this crisis, but from what we know about how humans have responded to previous crises. And how they respond is they look for the ideas that are left lying around. They don't have time to build new ideas in a crisis. They're like looking and trying to find the things that make sense moving forward. So something like the Green New Deal, having so much traction moving into this moment is a huge plus. In concrete terms for next steps, the disaster footing will not be maintained. So I appreciate Sephora's desire. I've had the thought myself how awesome it would be to have the chief climate health officer on TV every night or every morning. The reality is even the medical health officer, we've seen a sharp drop in listening to science over the last couple of weeks. Like we're 10 weeks into this now and people just can't maintain their discipline around the science or their response to the science. So to draw a line from our new strengths, this idea of mutual aid, we're all in this together, agile management, to the ones we were already growing. And I think you have your answer. You sort of intersect those two, the disaster access with the trajectory that we were on. So our economic recovery needs to be about resetting the economy to make us stronger, cleaner, and healthier. So not a recovery, but a building back better scenario. It needs to be about shifting power back to home from away, because that away has become an obvious Achilles heel in a pandemic, but I think it's always been an Achilles heel for a province like British Columbia. We need to think about building from home outwards. And it needs to be an economy where everyone can see themselves reflected and valued, able to prosper and build a strong, resilient future for themselves and their families. The simple language, are you secure in your own home, whether that's your literal home or your metaphorical home of community, city, region, province. Simply put, you need to be bold and step into the current space and declare you're going to own it. It sounds so simple, but in the current environment, that type of clarity has power, and it's going to have a lot of momentum that will get traction from Victoria, from Ottawa, the public, and the people in the world looking to invest in an emerging future right now. So some specific ideas about what it might look like. I think this is the moment that we should be declaring the filters that building back better looks like. We should be mobilizing spokespeople, not from the elite, but from the informal power bases, the experts, the referent power, the people who live in the truth, to start painting a picture for people of what a collaborative, clean, and strong post-COVID economy looks like. Some examples of filter based on where our trajectory was before pandemic hit: clean, smart, healthy, and innovative, so zero carbon and pollution. This means supporting new processes, products, and business models that can clean up existing extractive industries and grow new clean tech and clean, smart, healthy, and innovative industries. Those are all things British Columbia is well known for, certainly in North America, but also globally, and where we can strongly build out from. Needs to be homegrown, and we need to invest in BC first, with particular priority to Indigenous peoples to lead recovery through clean tech and clean, smart, healthy, and innovative industries. Yes, that is the fourth time I have said that in under a minute, because we need to say it that many times for people to get it. We have a $3 trillion export market out there waiting for these technologies, and it's an opportunity that I don't think we can, it would be foolish to ignore the investment in it. Mutual support, so prioritize local employment, starting with those areas hardest hit by primary economic sectors due to COVID. We should be looking at tourism dependent areas of this province first and saying, how can we help you from the lower mainland, even as we're suffering? I think we also need to think about mutual aid, the concept that Western Canada was built on. How are we reaching out to neighboring jurisdictions to assist them in achieving similar goals? So I know, but Alberta, this is a moment where we could be working together. In the same way the West was built, to create this building back better concept. I'd say the two keys to success, we really need to show, don't tell. I know we're on a webinar and there's been a lot of webinars, and I'm not opposed to this sharing, but I think we need to also think about how we're showing people what this looks like. I think that there's a lot of noise right now inside and outside of government, and the no one is more likely to prevail if someone isn't actively creating a strong positive narrative about what a prosperous Canada built on clean tech and clean, smart, healthy, and innovative industries looks like. Most importantly, people need to think about how they're going to feel. So show them, but they don't need graphs and they don't need like tiny words on PowerPoint slides. They need to see and feel something as they're looking at this. We need to think about alliance and cooperation. If in this message, we're not constantly talking about mutual support and aid, we lose the traction and abandon the value that people have most cleaved to in this period of time during the pandemic. So how do you know you're winning? In discussions about economic recovery, we are now talking about building back better with a clear vision of a clean, strong, innovative economic future that becomes more important to people than their view of the past and their nostalgia for it. People in BC felt seen by government in economic planning and implementation and have a sense of working together across our geography to be mutually supportive. And of course, targeted investment and supportive policy flows from Ottawa, who's got the big capacity right now, but also the provinces. So in closing, I'm just going to take you back to that concept of liminal space. For those who've been on a trip somewhere that you really wanted to go, I know it seems kind of amazing, right? Remember when we used to get like on Canada Lines or in cabs or in our cars and go to an airport and get on a plane and go somewhere? There are two things. I think sort of about ferry trips to islands. And I think about how you really want to go, right? You want to get to Hornby Island, or you want to get to Tofino, or wherever it is, Bainbridge, name an island. But it is interminably long to get there. And the entire way there, you will be both nostalgic about the last time you were there, and you will bitch endlessly about the distance and how long it takes and waiting and all of those things. The second thing, there is absolutely no way while you're bitching about the long journey that you would ever say, I think we should turn around and just go back before we get there. Of course, you would never do that, because the whole point of all that journey is that the sacrifice of it is made worthwhile by where we're going, where we're getting to, not by where we're coming from. So here's the point on how it relates to this moment. The greatest tragedy possible right now is not that we went through pandemic, but that we went through it for nothing. That all this loss just gets us back to where we were when we started, economic recovery, right? How are we going to build back that better? Can we sustain collective courage that we've shown these last number of weeks? The world we have the opportunity to build is one where the best of the COVID times, the we're all in this together, the mutual support and aid, the agile management, can be taken forward to grow better communities, not just protect them from ruin. That we give people this vision of where they're going. And it's the opportunity of this moment and the call to action on the other side of liminal space. We can own the future right now. It's an incredible precipice to be standing on. I'm excited to see where we can take the conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrea. That's a lot to think about. What is this future that we're imagining, and can we be more solutions oriented? So many things to talk about now. This is the opportunity that we have for all of you to take a moment to kind of reflect together. And we're going to break out into small groups really quickly, just randomly. We want you to take 15 minutes. First, to just introduce yourselves and very briefly highlight what surprised or inspired you from what you've just heard, so that you kind of capture from each other the things that really stand out. And there's a lot to talk about. And the question for inquiry today is, in the wake of the global pandemic, what is the biggest reset opportunity from your perspective? We want to get your ideas on the table too. And there is a Google Doc that's going to be appearing in your chat. And for those of you that can just are willing to just click it, it will take you to a doc. You're going to be organized into numbered groups. And if you look at the number of your group corresponding to the number on the Google Doc, if one of you would be so kind as to just write a few key notes. We want to be able to capture some of your best thinking from the small groups. And when we come back after 15 minutes and a brief break, then we're going to share those out to the plenary and have Sephora and Andrea make some comments on the things that are emerging from this conversation so far. Lots of ideas percolating on the chat already. But now we're going to switch you. Julian's going to push some buttons and move us into small groups. And you'll be reminded that the first is a brief introduction among yourselves. And then around this question, talk about what is the biggest reset opportunity for climate action right now, in your view. And then we're going to hear back from you and our speakers. So enjoy your moment together, and we'll see you back here very shortly.
To start with, though, we have Alison Shaw from ACT, the Adaptation to Climate Change team at SFU. She has here a comment that she wants to share with us. Alison, are you there? And can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, Oliver. Hi, Joanna. Thank you for inviting me today. I am affiliated with the Adaptation to Climate Change team at SFU, and I'm also the principal of a sustainability and climate change consulting company called Flipside Sustainability. And so what we're interested in at SFU in our research is really instructive and constructive ways of embedding low carbon resilience approaches into local governments. And so one of the things that we're looking at right now, or what we were doing before COVID, was working with 13 case communities across the province of all different sizes, and looking at really novel and practical ways of building in policies and plans and projects that actually increase community resilience in the face of climate impacts. So the expectation is that over the coming decades, over the coming year, many communities in British Columbia can expect flooding impacts from a strong spring freshet, or wildfires from a very hot, dry summer. And many local communities are on the front lines of taking action to build adaptive strategies to confront these things. And, you know, at the same time as building in adaptation strategies that help kind of reduce vulnerability to these impacts on infrastructure, on populations, on our ecosystems, these local governments are also committing to finding different solutions that are low carbon solutions. So thinking outside the box in order to figure out how to bolster their resilience toward climate impacts, but in a low carbon way. And so we've been working with communities on the front lines doing this work. And of course, COVID has struck and shown us the fault lines of vulnerability in communities in a very magnified way. And so a lot of our communities right now are taking stock of, one, as Andrea mentioned, their adaptive management approaches. So how in the face of disaster do our local governments and communities provide core services that are safe and resilient? Despite catastrophe. So water, sewage, all of these kinds of things that we are privileged to have during this COVID disaster in BC and in Canada. But also how to start bolstering the populations that are most affected by disaster. And so in COVID, those populations are very similar to the populations that we look at in thinking about vulnerability to climate impacts. So the elderly, children, the poor, the disabled, those that have limited capacity to adapt to, you know, higher heat exposure or increased flood events if you're living in floodplain area. So these are the kinds of questions that are starting to emerge at the local scale that are making climate action, both building resilience and transitioning toward low carbon futures, really front and center. And one of the things that we're finding are communities like Gibson's, for instance, who is working with us, has developed really comprehensive planning to build a resilience strategy for its community. And this resilience strategy has been tested during COVID. And so in terms of organizational management, the town has been really responsive in terms of emergency response and effectiveness. They had a plan prior to COVID that has now being rolled out and deemed highly effective. So all of these preparations to prepare for more frequent and higher magnitude climate impacts are actually bolstering the underlying foundations of some of the communities that we're working with. But really, in terms of the reset opportunity at the community scale, well, not even just the community scale. I think these ideas really bring to bear the concept of managing the avoidable and avoiding the unmanageable. So we need to start thinking critically about how nature wants to kill us. Like Sephora had mentioned early on. I think we've become far too complacent in our understanding of how our systems prior to COVID are going to bolster us in the face of disaster. I think anything that we can learn from this COVID is about, you know, how do we kind of bring back concepts of resilience to the community level? As Andrea said, how do we make people feel secure in their homes? And when disaster strikes, what that means is, how do we ensure that our economics are afloat in our communities? How do we ensure that we have circular economies that can kind of ground us? How can we make sure that all people within the community are cared for and have some safety net, some semblance of a safety net? These are the kinds of questions that our local governments are thinking about and struggling with in a cross-departmental, cross-sectoral way. And so it's really exciting work that really brings back concepts of what define economic growth in our current systems. Instead of focusing on growth, how do we reorient toward this concept of low carbon resilience building at the local, provincial, and federal scale? And most importantly, how do we operationalize the old adage, think globally and act locally? You know, how do we, as individuals, participate in our communities and fill the gaps that need to be filled and will continue need to be filled moving forward in terms of generating nonprofit organizations or volunteering, all of these forms of resilience building that have been neglected and haven't had enough of the spotlight shone on them. These are kind of the areas that are going to be really important moving forward in the local governments that we're working with.
Thank you, Alice. And that's great. If you could share some of those resources of case studies, like for the one you mentioned for Gibson's, with the audience, maybe share the link in the chat if there's anything that's available online. That ties in nicely to a couple of comments about basically the concern of going back to, or using the term recovery, going back to what was normal and where we felt safe. So making sure that resilience is planned around low carbon, or that adaptation is planned around low carbon is super important. So those were a couple of comments mentioned there. The concern that we will rush back to the normal where people feel comfortable. We should be focusing on green jobs. There are a couple of comments maybe for Andrea and Sephora, if you want to jump in, about consumer action. And is there a role for concerned citizens? Or should the focus be really on pushing government and government legislation to move us quickly with the speed that is needed in the right direction? So what is the role of citizens, concerned citizens? Andrea and Sephora, anyone want to jump in on that?
I would say all of the above. And I think this is always the challenge, right? Like there is not a perfect answer. You should just feel called to action, as we have in the pandemic, right? Like it's the lesson of this moment is like, get going on whatever you're doing. Build it, learn, test, repeat, rebuild. You know, this is the cycle that we're in. I would say that from government's perspective, as someone who was in government for a long time, the idea that government is not an aggregate of the people who elected it is a false idea. Government does not exist separately from the body of people that vote for it. So if you're taking bad climate destroying actions in your day-to-day lives when you have other alternatives that you can afford and are convenient to access, but expecting government to do otherwise, that's not going to work. So you do need as much as is practical, and key things, affordable and convenient to access, are critical things here. But assuming those things are true, you need to align your actions with the actions you expect out of the governments that you elect.
I absolutely agree. Excuse my dog. That's the thing about doing these things from home. I don't know if you can hear him, but I want to add 2 more points to what Andrea just said. The first is actually as a parent. So I think that the scale of the change that is required in the time frame that we have requires legislative action and massive scale action by major corporations. And so then, you know, on that front, it is clear to me that it's not about whether we're buying better light bulbs, it's about whether we have better laws. And therefore, your actions as a voter, engaging members of parliament, signing those petitions, making those calls to parliament, asking for a meeting with your MLA or your MP, those things matter, or your city councilor. I know from decades now of working in advocacy campaigns, those things matter. And so I would say that that is most important, but back to the comment as a parent, children learn what they live. And the way that we're living right now is so clearly unsustainable in terms of how much we consume, etc. Do we just throw stuff out, or do we fix it? Do we teach our kids how to fix it? Do they, you know, those kinds of things are absolutely critical to as we reboot. So I think that the answer is both. I think that the most important thing you can do if you're going to do one thing is to call your MP or your MLA or your city councilor and to tell them you care about the scale of climate action that they're taking. But I do think that consumption does matter. It matters more on some issues than others. This information is readily available on Carbon Budget. Use it. We all personally have to act according to the science as well. You take one less flight, for example, and you're going to have massive implications in your own personal carbon budget. And, you know, as a mother, this really came home to me because of the choices that our children don't have right now, especially if they're looking at the science. I have a son who's in university now, who is looking at the science, but desperately wants to travel. This life goal has always been to be some kind of National Geographic journalist and travel. And he said to me, but I guess I'm not going to do that. And that's not appropriate in the climate era. And of course, as a mother, I just want him to have every opportunity he can. And I said, well, why not? You know, you're so good at writing, blah, 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 and I'm doing the arguments. And he looked at me and he said, well, because you used up my carbon budget. And I, you know, it's again what Greta Thunberg has been saying to the world. They're right. And so we have to, I think, live by example to the best of our ability in the climate era at this moment. But we also definitely need to be engaging with decision makers, government and corporations. Corporations do respond to what citizens are doing and saying and what they're hearing about. And so I think those things are critical.
Thank you, Sephora. Thank you, Andrea. I think we're coming close to 11 o'clock. There's a couple more questions. Here, one from, I think from Vince. What about cultural narratives that drive the shared responsibility and agile management to the forefront of people's minds and behavior for the next decade? Do you have any comments on that?
I'll jump in. I would say that I think it's 100% cultural narrative right now. Well, okay, 98% cultural narrative, if you choose it to be, right? Like that's the arc we're on, is what we have together is a story about this time we're spending together. I think the challenge of that is that we're not colliding, and I mean colliding in a positive way. We don't have the same level of collision that we were having. So I think there's an increasing challenge of being bifurcated or sort of stuck in our little rooms that we're in together. So I think that is one of the key challenges right now, is how do you have all these cultures colliding in ways that they can hear and see each other when we're stuck in an online world?
I'll say two quick things because I know our time is limited. I think the narrative that we have created in the environmental community around climate change and climate action has not served us well. And that now is a moment to really reboot that as well. And what I mean by that is, sure, it's important to name names. It's important to show, for example, as Naomi Reski does in Merchants of Doubt, that a company like Exxon has been hiding evidence, et cetera, for years. It's important to show that oil and gas companies have been lobbying daily, multiple times a day, to maintain the status quo, sure. But what we have failed to do is to also create a sense of common purpose and to locate all of us and ourselves in the problem. And that's a cultural narrative that needs to shift. I spoke in Alberta a couple of years ago, and I opened up my talk saying we didn't know. None of us knew. We didn't know, when we all benefited from the oil and gas industry for decades, that the dramatic expansion would have these cumulative impacts on our water, on people's health, on the climate. We didn't know. We've all benefited, and now we have to figure out what to do together. And it doesn't mean that anyone who works in this industry is a bad person, but it does mean that we all have a collective responsibility to change. I had a lineup of people waiting after the talk in tears, people who lived and worked in Fort McMurray, saying they'd never heard an environmentalist talk about it like that. And they didn't mean to be a bad person. They were engineers, and this was the job they got after college. This is a moment in history where we need all hands on deck. We need new narratives about what we can do together, about how we're all in this together. And we need a new cultural narrative in Canada that sees us as not just hewers of wood and carriers of water. This idea that our economy was born out of extraction, and this is what we do. We do mining, we do oil and gas, we do logging. This is what we are as Canadians, so we just have to defend it. It's bullshit. That's not the fastest growing parts of our economy right now. In fact, the fastest growing parts of our economy are high tech and service and clean tech and film and many other parts of the economy that are low carbon. Don't deny that the fossil fuel industry has been an important part of getting us to where we are. But just because it's what we did doesn't mean it's going to be what we do together in the future. And we need a new narrative about who we are as Canadians and what we can do together.
Thank you. That was very inspiring. I think we have to wrap up. We had a closing question here, and both of you have sort of addressed it. What kind of leadership do we need at this moment? I'm speaking now from SPEC, from an environmental organization. We work with members of the community, and I think other organizations go through the same thing. We struggle with finding is it the right time? What language should we use? What are we asking people to engage on? So I've heard you mention write to your MP, sign petitions. Are there any other advice that you might have for community leaders, people in neighborhood groups that are just wanting to engage others to jump on this right now and fast?
I want to build on something Andrea said because it will stay with me and I really appreciate it. The perfect is the enemy of the good at this moment. We have to try things. Some of them are going to work and some of them are going to fail. And then we have to adapt. And we have to encourage people to leap in with both feet, however they want to leap in. So it's not about what is the perfect way to say this anymore. It's not about what is the perfect policy. It's about trying everything. It's about using evidence and science for sure, trying things that are already working in other places in the world, specific examples that will inspire people. Just like in nature, diversity is in our strength. That's where we will find our strength. And the idea that any one person, any one leader, any one sector has all of the answers in this moment in history, it's not true. So I would say encourage that diversity of engagement.
Thank you.
What I would say, I would just maybe build on that a bit. And it's just sort of struck me in this last bit, Oliver. I was talking in my talk about the need to throw out the answers we used to have, but I think we also need to throw out the questions we used to have, right? Because that is the point. Like we can't, the what should we do in this moment it's a question from the pre-pandemic times, right? We should just be in this moment. We should own this moment. We should talk into this moment. We should be vulnerable in this moment. We need to acknowledge our own loss. We need to give people the space to acknowledge their loss. We need to acknowledge that we've seen that happen. And we also need to talk about the positive future that we're heading towards. Like, think of yourself on the ferry going to Tofino or Cortez or wherever it is you go, on the flight, in the car, wherever it is, and how excited you are for this future. And then if you're excited about it, what does it look like? If you really, I can give you one final resource that I have found recently that I think is super helpful. Stacey Abrams from Georgia, she has a great TED Talk on TED Women. And she talks about the 3 questions to ask yourself. So if you're not ready to talk and own this moment, I would go check out her talk. She talks about defining, what do I need? Why do I need it? Which is a very critical question to ask yourselves. And what do I need to get this thing that I need? And I think it's 18 minutes of your life that you can very quickly develop a framework from, but then go out there and own this moment.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. Very inspiring. Let's see. I think that's about it. I want to thank Sephora Berman and Andrea REIMER for joining us today, and all of you participants. I think we had just under 100 people joining the call. I know a lot of you, most of you work in the climate field or you're concerned citizens, so thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank our sponsors and supporters of this event, Participedia.net, SFU's Faculty of the Environment, SPEC, and the North Family Foundation, and our media sponsor, Canada's National Observer. We would also like to thank the Vancouver design nerds, Jesse and Julian there, who have been at the helm of the technical production of the session. As we wrap up, I invite you, if you want to share a word or a phrase in the chat box about how you're leaving this session, what you're feeling, what are your hopes, any words of encouragement, any last reflection in a word or two, we welcome that. We are, as Joanna mentioned, recording the content that we're all producing as a group. We also want to remind you that this is only the first session out of 5 sessions. The next one coming up is Communicating Urgency, Motivating and Equipping the Public for Climate Action with Professor Shane Gunster and Global News producer and PhD candidate Cam Razavi. So I think Julian is going to paste the link there in the chat box for you to sign up for the next sessions. Also, we'll be sending out a little survey probably today or maybe tomorrow, just to gather some feedback of your thoughts on this session. And as Joanna mentioned initially, we'll leave this space open for another 20 minutes. If you want to stay and connect through the chat, share some resources, we'll be there until about 11:20, 11:30. So thank you, everybody. Joanna, I'm not sure if you want to add anything else. You're on mute.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Sephora. As always, you surpass expectations, and thank you to all the people that joined us on the call today. I think just looking at the notes that people took in their small groups and the questions that arose in the chat, we're stimulating some really important thinking. But I just love the idea that let's be in this, and we will be with the words that you've shared, I think for some time now. And I think that this is the potential to direct what happens when we get off the ferry and we step onto this new land. Very excited to kind of co-create that with all of those who participated today, and that we hope to continue to meet you in the weeks to come. So thanks again, and thanks to all the crew that worked on this from all our different organizations. This really meant a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
So do stay around if you can. We'll just keep working on the chat. I saw some great comments, people as they leave. The checkout, I think, is always really important. So any resources you have that you want to share, this is the time. You're also welcome to download the file so that you can take those with you. And this talk will be posted on our project website. We'll send you a note too, where you can find it if you want to circulate it to others. So thanks again. And I'm sure Andrea and Sephora, I don't know if you've got to run off to other meetings, other Zoom calls. You feel free to exit whenever you have to, but wonderful to have you here and to have all of this amazing community online today. So thank you.